move on to this story here with Aaron Maté and Norm Finkelstein. So thank you to those of you who reached out to me after I covered the interview with Bree and Norm Finkelstein a couple of days ago. Some of you reached out to me and said that I needed to watch this one. So I did that. So here I am. Here I am. But there's three parts I want to talk about here. I'm going to start with the first part when he's talking about, I think this is the part about community. Oh, no, Paul. He's talking about identity politics first. So I want you guys to understand that, Norm Finkelstein, he wrote a new book called About the Left Canceling Itself. So the name of this video is called Norm Finkelstein on How the Left Cancels Itself. And we're going to talk about that tonight on Call In. And I want you to think about that and think about some of the things that you may have seen happen, let's say within the past year or two, and if you think that that's true. But he's going to start off here talking about identity politics and where he feels that went wrong on the left. And I'll chime in here and in between.
However, there was a problem here. And here's where I became quite irritated and I should say motivated to write the book. It became very clear that in the moment of truth, if we might use that expression, which was the Bernie Sanders campaign, the identity politics was being instrumentalized, weaponized in order to stop the Bernie campaign. So we had those who claimed that the Bernie campaign was all about white men. And they said it was all about Bernie bros. So the women chimed in, best known being Gloria Steinem, who tried to discredit the Bernie campaign by saying, oh, yeah, it's true. Some women go along also, but they just go to the rallies to meet guys, which, by the way, was so off the mark. It was not only deeply condescending and disgusting, but it was also so off the mark. I was very active in the Bernie campaign, and I went on the buses out of town to campaign outside the state.
I just want to chime in here for a second and add to this as well. It was interesting how mainstream media tried to pretend like Bernie Sanders didn't have any women or any Black people that were a part of his campaign and that all of his supporters were just white men. That was really interesting because how could you ignore the fact that his press secretary was a Black woman? They would talk about this as if Bree wasn't even there. It was just really weird to me. And people bought it. People bought into it, which is the sad part, right? They would pretend like Nina Turner wasn't a part of this campaign, that Cornel West wasn't a part of the campaign, Danny Glover wasn't a part of the campaign. All these people, Dr. Dooley wasn't a part of the campaign. All these people that were African-American, and some of them who were women that were directly a part of the campaign, mainstream media pretended as though the only people that were a part of this campaign and the only people that supported Bernie Sanders were white men. I don't even know where the Bernie bro term started, where it originated, but I do remember hearing it over and over. And I went to these rallies, and Norm, he's part of this too. I went to these rallies. When I went to the Bernie rally here in Boston, over 10,000 people, you think it was just 10,000 men? No, there were women. There were plenty of women. There were people of all different ages. There were people of all different races. But this was something that mainstream media was able to, when it came to Paul with this particular issue, mainstream media was able to use it to their advantage to the point that people didn't even check to see for themselves if it were true. It was ridiculous to me.
I have to say, I was deeply struck, deeply moved, deeply touched by the seriousness of these young people. In my generation, you went on the bus to Washington, which was commonplace for a demonstration against the war. And before you knew it, the bus was saturated with marijuana smoke. Everybody's passing around a joint. And I have to say, I come from a kind of austere Puritan background, and I was slightly put off by it, but that was, the hippie culture. When you went on the buses, the men, the women, young men, young women, your age and younger, in the Bernie campaign, they were so serious, so focused, so not lightheaded. But along comes Gloria Steinem. It's just about meeting boys. Then along comes Ta-Nehisi Coates. Bernie's weak on the reparations question. Bernie has a serious problem with Black people. And Kimberly Crenshaw, she comes along and she says, well, the real action is happening in corporate America, not with those, now I'm paraphrasing, not with those old Jewish schmucks like Bernie Sanders.
This is where I have to chime in here for a second. When I interviewed Cornel West, I did ask Cornel West about the reparations issue with Bernie Sanders. And even Cornel West said to me that Bernie Sanders did not agree on that issue. I played an interview for you on this show with Bernie Sanders saying at that time he did not agree with reparations for African Americans. Now, it's one thing for Bernie to not agree with that and just to not agree with reparations in general. But the problem came in when we were able to point back to legislation and we were able to point back to talking points from Bernie Sanders where he was totally in agreement with reparations for his people. He just wasn't in agreement for reparations for African Americans. That was the problem that people had with Bernie Sanders. And I want to point this out. Let's use Joe Biden as an example. Did you hear Black voters saying, I'm not going to vote for Joe Biden. He don't agree with reparations? Nope. Did you hear people saying, I sure as hell am not thinking about voting for Pete Buttigieg because he don't agree on reparations? No. There was one candidate that they said that about, and that was Bernie Sanders. And it was because he agreed with it for one group, but not for the other. That's why they were able to hit him with that one. And I knew it. I said back then, I was like, Bernie, that was not a good answer because they're gonna call you hypocrite and say that you were okay with it for your people, but you weren't okay with it for Black people. You see, the problem with the other people on the stage, with the exception of Marianne Williamson, who did support reparations for African-American descendants of slavery, with the exception of her, the other candidates on the stage, what did they say? The best Kamala Harris said was, oh, well, we need to look at it and research it. Even Kamala knew not to go with a yes or no. You see what I mean? She knew if she went with a yes or no, then they're really going to typecast you. You're going to be pigeonholed. That's why a lot of them didn't even comment on it. Pete didn't comment on it. Joe Biden didn't comment on it. All those other 20, it was like 20 something people running, didn't comment on it. But Bernie Sanders to publicly say in interviews that he didn't agree with it, but there was records showing that you agreed with it for your people. That was a key point for them to come and attack. That's why they came after Bernie Sanders in reference to that. I would really love to have this conversation with Norm. Maybe I'll look and see if I can find contact information for him because that piece is very crucial. Let's go on.
The real action is Amazon is acknowledging identity politics. And so there was this confluence of identity politics spokespersons doing everything in their power, including, I have to say, and I say it with regret, including Angela Davis, who was using her platform to attack Bernie on the race issue.
Angela Davis is a liberal now. She's not. Look, I looked this up myself. The Angela Davis that we read about and we watched documentaries about, Angela Davis is not that Angela anymore. Some of the radical, like revolutionaries that we read about from the 60s, 50s, 70s aren't so radical or revolutionary anymore. Hit that like button, guys.
And so I quote in the book a passage from Leon Trotsky where he says, you have all these types who pretend to be super radical, but then he says, at the moment of truth, they reveal their true colors. And that's exactly what happened. The Bernie campaign was the moment of truth. Where do you stand? And Norman,
it's the moment of truth. It's the moment of truth because that's the moment where Bernie's candidacy is the best hope for material gains for all of these marginalized people that these pundits claim to speak for.
Exactly. This was a genuinely radical movement, the most radical movement, certainly in the United States, in half a century or more than half a century. close to a century, since the 1930s. And they were doing everything in their power to sabotage it. And it was at that point that I started to think hard and fast, what's going on here? And I did something which is my, so to speak, my métier. I'm known, I have a reputation, I think deserved, of being a forensic scholar. Namely, I go through documents, I look for logic, I look for reasoning, I check the footnotes, and I'll tell you the truth. I went into this project pretty much tabula rasa. I hadn't studied it closely. I knew a tidbit of African American history, but the field has expanded exponentially since I studied it as a young man. It's a very serious discipline right now. I don't really know the literature, and I'm frank about that. I've written mostly on, as you say, the Israel-Palestine conflict. I wrote a couple of books on the Nazi Holocaust. I wrote a book on Gandhi. But this was terra incognita for me. It was something new. So I just sat down and I said, you know what? I'm not going to read the secondary literature. I'm not going to read background. I'm just going to sit down, open these books, and apply a simple test. Does this make any sense? Is there any?
No, I mean, these books are, for example, White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo.
Kennedy's Stamped from the Beginning and How to Be an Anti-Racist. Ta-Nehisi Coates' article on reparations. Kimberly Crenshaw's article on intersectionality. And I just sat down and I asked the question, does this make any sense?
Does it make sense to who? See, this is why I know some of the people he's talking about. Robin DiAngelo, she came to speak at BU. I saw her there talking about that book. Here's what I would say to you guys. I recommend you read these books for yourself before you criticize them. Read these books for yourself. Because there are some things that are mentioned in these books. I don't agree with everything that's in the books, but there are some things that are mentioned in these books that really do speak truth to power. It may be uncomfortable truths. It may be some things that you are not going to be comfortable hearing. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that right now. Kimberly Crenshaw has talked a lot about intersectionality. I've talked about her before on this show. We did a whole panel about that over at RBN. And then Dr. Kendi, also, again, another person who he teaches at BU. He is the one responsible for the anti-racist center, research center at BU, which is new. So they started that when I was still working there. And again, I don't agree with everything that these scholars have to say in their books, but there are some things in their books that are uncomfortable truths. And if it makes you uncomfortable to hear it, maybe you should ask why. But again, it's like, Norm is asking like, well, does it make sense? But make sense to who? Because just because it doesn't make sense to Norm doesn't mean it doesn't make sense to me. You know what I'm saying? Like, it's things like that. Let's go on.
And I have to say, I went through it methodically. Some people felt in excess of methodically. The chapter on Ibram X. Kendi is over 100 pages. But the truth be told, and here I'm not being facetious, the truth be told, Kendi's book is being used everywhere. It has been widely adopted. And nobody, I'm saying nobody, has gone through it chapter and verse and seen whether this makes any sense, what he's writing. And so even though I admit that the book is exhaustive in ways which some people might find painful, on the other hand, I think it was a needed exercise to apply the most demanding scholarly standards and to see, does this hold up? And it doesn't. I also have a very long chapter, the longest chapter in the book on Baroque.
It doesn't hold up to who, though? Because see, this is the thing, is like, when you talk about these people, when you talk about like Dr. Kendi, again, I don't agree with everything that he says. When you talk about Dr. Kendi, when you talk about Kimberly Crenshaw, when you talk about Robin DiAngelo, again, like Robin DiAngelo's book, White Fragility, she's speaking about the white community as a white person and the things that she has seen and the problems she's seen with it. And she's more so talking about like the liberals, right? Okay. Kimberly Crenshaw and Dr. Kendi, they're both African American. And so their experiences, which I do know about their experiences, they are very different from the experiences that Norm has. They don't have the same type of upbringing. They didn't have the same type of challenges. Very different. And these two, both of them, they're older than me. So just keep that in mind. But I think that's the thing, is like, does it hold up according to who? According to Norm? According to who is the person that signs off on if something holds up or not? Let's ask ourselves this question. Who are the ones that do that? Let's go on. And then I'm gonna go to the second part.
Obama, because he became a kind of woke test. You proved your wokeness by being pro-Obama or praising Obama's brilliance and whatever else. And that too was a question of curiosity to me, because speaking strictly as a layperson from afar, I saw no evidence of any brilliance there. I didn't see any evidence of any political acumen there. And so I did the same thing. I sat down, went through the record, and see what I came up with. And I came up with a lot of zeros. And one of the magic
he didn't need to have any brilliance. See, this is the thing. Barack Obama didn't need to have brilliance. All he had to have was two things. He had Harvard Law School on his resume, and he had, no, I don't know if I want to mention that part. I might get in trouble for saying that. Let me just say it this way. He was chosen. He was chosen by people who have opinions that actually matter very much in government. And two, he had Harvard Law School on his resume. You don't really need it, but you got that. And then add on top of it that he's African American. That's all you kind of need. It's just, that's how it works. That's how it works. So I don't know. Again, this is funny.
Qualities of a zero is you could take 4 zeros and add them up, and guess what? You still get 0. So there was nothing there. And then the question then became, if there's nothing there, then why has it gotten so much traction? Why?
Because he was chosen. Because he was chosen. And then also, as Steven said it, he had Oprah. No, it's true. He had Oprah in his corner. You got to understand, people were like, this could be the first Black president. So that was very significant at that time. And yes, some people only focused on that and only voted for him because of that reason. So you had someone who was running for president. They were African American. They went to Harvard Law School. And on top of that, there were people that actually in government that actually wanted him there. And the media, mainstream media, loved Barack Obama. And if you got the media on your side and you got Harvard Law School and you're Black and people in government want you there, that's a shoo-in. That's a shoo-in.
This identity politics got so much traction. And my conclusion is that it's basically been weaponized by the Democratic Party for 2 reasons. Number one, they want to replace their white working class base, which was which was identified with the working class since FDR, since Franklin Delano Roosevelt. They wanted to replace it with identity politics. And number two, because the identity politics was a useful weapon at this juncture in time. You see, that's the key point. The Bernie Sanders campaign, or the Bernie Sanders, let's call it idea, it came to fruition. You recall Bernie, when people used to say about Bernie Sanders is, oh, Bernie Sanders, he's been saying the same thing for 50 years. Yes, it's true. He's been saying the same thing for 50 years, except guess what? The times caught up with him. And now what he had to say actually resonated in ways, as you recall, he didn't imagine. When he went out in 2016, he says, what the hell, I'll go out and give a few stump speeches for socialism. And he was absolutely shocked by what happened. He did not expect it. He was totally bewildered. Of course, by 2020, he was seasoned. He knew what he wanted to do, how to achieve it, and the gains were significant. The shortcomings were also significant.
Even when he came to Boston, when I saw him here, when he got up to the stage, he said, holy crap, this is a lot of people. It was like over 10,000 people. I don't think he was expecting that. I really don't.
But that's for a separate discussion. So the key is this identity politics emerged as a political force just at the moment where a radical socialist workers' movement aimed at the redistribution of wealth and the radical transformation of our society became a real possibility.
Yeah, those are good points. Like I told you, some parts of this I do agree with him on, and then there are parts of this I don't agree with. I'm going to go to the second part here, which is, oh yeah, okay. 2420. Okay. The second part that he brings up here, yeah, right about here. I think this piece is important too, because I want to cover two different sections. So we're going on to a different topic here. But again, I get some of the things that he's saying about, like, yes, they did use those things to attack Bernie Sanders' campaign. But I'm sorry, like, especially like when he ran in 2020, he should have saw that coming, because he had already went through it in 2016. So he should have known they were going to do that in 2020, But in reference to, like, reparations and stuff like that, I still say that was Bernie Sanders' fault. Like, you can't, how you going to be for it for, one group and say you're against it for another group, like, and you were for it for your people, but not for Black people. So that was a mask off moment for Bernie Sanders. And I know several Black people did not like that. Let's move on to this part here.
Buses out of town. When I was a leftist, being a white leftist in the era of Black power, it was a kind of noblesse oblige. You went out not as a subject, not as part of the oppression, but you were a white person. You go to the rallies, clenched fist, off the pigs, totally ridiculous, insane. This was completely different. Because your generation has been homogenized by the capitalist system, such that someone like yourself, someone like a roommate of yours, you're just a tiny notch above Black people.
Pause. Oh my God. Let's hear that again. I want you guys to hear it so just make sure I'm not mishearing this myself. Okay? All right. And then I'm going to point out why this is actually not true. I think I know what he's trying to get out, but this is not true. Listen to this.
You went out not as a subject, not as part of the oppression, but you were a white person. You go to the rallies, clenched fist, off the pigs, totally ridiculous, insane. This was completely different. Because your generation has been homogenized by the capitalist system, such that someone like yourself, someone like a roommate of yours, you're just a tiny notch above Black people.
I have to disagree with that. Oh God, where do I begin? Let me explain why that's incorrect. On this show, I've talked about net worth multiple times. And again, I wouldn't expect it seems like when he does interviews, because I've seen him do this interview with Brianna Joy Gray, he talks for a long time, like when he's answering a question. What I'm about to say right now, I wouldn't have expected Aaron to chime in and say this. This is based on my personal experience and based on data that I've seen as a Black person. Okay. Number one, we've talked about net worth on this show multiple times. I have told you and explained to you how net worth is more important than income. Your net worth is what you own minus what you owe. So even if you have an income that's $100,000 a year, if you don't own anything and you owe over $200,000 in student loan debt, your net worth is in the negative. Okay, let's start with this piece. Let's start with net worth. I explained to you that there was a study done by the Boston Globe where they were doing a racism study in Boston. During that study, they found that when you look at the net worth of Black people and white people in Boston, that white people have a net worth of $250K, $250,000. Black people have a net worth of $8. And it's not just Boston. You can look up this data for your own city. Look up the data for San Francisco. Look up the data from Los Angeles. Look it up for Dallas, Texas. Look it up for New York City. And you'll find similar results where when you look at the net worth between white people and Black people, there is a significant gap. There's a big difference between $250,000 and $8. Big difference. So when Norm says, he's explaining that white people are just a smidge above Black people, economically, that's not true. And that's been proven false multiple times in this country. And I can tell you from my own experience. I went to undergrad, I went to grad school. Yes, I took out student loans. Yes, most of my friends had student loans. But you know what I noticed? I noticed when I was in undergrad that most of my white classmates, they came from wealth. That doesn't necessarily mean that their family were rich, but what it does mean is that they sure as hell didn't have to take out as much in student loans as I did. The Black college students had more debt because we were less likely to come from wealth. We had no generational wealth. You see, this is the difference. So even when it got to the point where economically in this country, we were struggling, even right now, with inflation, my white peers are still doing better than I am economically because they have less debt and they have a higher net worth. They are coming from families of wealth. So for him to say they're just a smidge above Black people, that's not true. That is not true. My white comrades don't have to get worried about being pulled over by the police just because they're driving while white. They don't have to deal with that. They don't have to deal with the police brutality. They don't have to deal with, well, they're not in poor areas as well. They don't have to deal with that. They don't have to deal with the job racial discrimination where they're not chosen for positions because they already have a Black person in the office. They ain't got to deal with that. They ain't got to worry about which neighborhood they can buy a house in. They don't have to deal with redlining. They don't have to deal with being dismissed by realtors because of the color of their skin, where you can send in a white friend to that same realtor who told the Black friend that there was nothing left on the market, and you send in a white friend and they'll tell them, oh yes, let me show you what we have. These kind of studies are still being done today. It's not just something that happened back in the 60s. It's not just something that happened back in the 70s and the 80s. There are still people doing these studies today to show you just how racist this country is systemically when it comes to Black people trying to acquire any type of wealth. You see, Norm don't have to go through that. Norm ain't got to deal with all that. I had to deal with that. As someone who's a homeowner, I had to deal with that. You see what I'm saying? You see the difference? So even though economically, yes, we all being hit right now because of inflation and because of the gas prices and the food prices, all of us are dealing with that. Most of us, yes, have student loan debt. But I even just told you my white peers have less than I do. And this includes some of them that have more than a master's degree. Okay? So they're still not just a smidge above me, man. This is the kind of things I'm sorry, but I hate to call it out, but I gotta say it. And maybe, one day I could have this conversation with Norm, but I think he really need to talk to somebody who's been in this position and has been in those shoes. And that's, no shade to Aaron, but Aaron's not going to know about this. And this is something that needs to be said. Like, I had to go through that shit, man. I still have to go through those things. And I'll still be turned away if I go to certain realtors. I'll still be turned away. So I'm sorry. And that's right here in Blue, Massachusetts. So they're not just a smidge above. Ain't no way, man.
You're not going into the middle class, your generation. You're not going to get a 40-hour-a-week job. You're going to have gigs just like blacks have gigs. And unusually, I know you wouldn't understand these things because a huge chasm in age separates us. We didn't live with black people. We didn't grow up with black people. Black people were a alien thing. Now, sometimes you would deeply identify with them. I deeply identified as a youth with Angela Davis. But it was something afar, many degrees removed, not 6 degrees removed.
This is another thing too. I'm so sorry. Like, again, I get what he's trying to say, but also, like, it seems like he has this perception that now all of a sudden today, black people and white people are just living together harmoniously. And that's really not the case still for the United States. Like, yes, it is a little bit more integrated than it was when he was growing up, but the United States is still very much segregated, especially if you come here in the Northeast. The Northeast is hyper segregated here. If you still go to cities like Chicago, there's still hyper segregation. There are towns here in Massachusetts that are like 100% white, where there are no black people, where I would not be welcomed in. You get what I'm saying? It's not just New England. There are parts of New York that are like this too, boo. I lived in New York City, and I'm here to tell you, there's some neighborhoods, I don't care how much money you have, if you're not a celebrity, they're not really trying to rent to you either. We got to keep this real here. I think that Norm has this idea that now everybody's just living together harmoniously. No, that's not true. That is not true. The most least segregated place I have ever lived was actually in the Southeast, in places like North Carolina and South Carolina. And even that's starting to change because of gentrification. The second most least segregated places that I lived was actually in Germany. Like, come on, was actually in Germany, where you think you would see less of me. So America is still very much heavily segregated. And I want Norm to understand this. These communities ain't really so much living together. And the reason why they were able to integrate so much is because of the military. Because a lot of the families that are in the military is all different races. And that's why my communities were the way that they were growing up. But when I became an adult and I started moving around and I started to see it's not so much that way. It's not so much. I'm sorry, but we got to call this out.
Generation, very different. You have 4 people living in a house. One person may be black, one person may be white, one person may be Latino, one person may be whatever. I have a Jewish friend, and he's quite, comes from a conservative background.
But that's not the norm, Norm. Like, that's not the norm. I've lived in those environments as well, but I'm trying to tell Norm, that is not the norm in this country, though. What he just described, that is still not the norm. Oh, dear God. I felt poor Aaron. Aaron's probably just like, I don't really know what he want me to say. I don't really know what he want me to say.
A young friend, your age, correspondent who I call a friend. I said, so who are your roommates? He says, oh, I have 2 black women as my roommates. Conservative Jew, 2 black women. Unthinkable in my generation. So because you now have real bonds with blacks, Latinos, people of different sexual orientations, real living bonds, and what's as important, and maybe even more important, you're just a notch above black people. You're just a notch above. And so there was
Like, I get what he's saying about the class issue. I get what he's saying. But I really think that we are not, this place is not in harmony. Like what he just described, where someone having a black roommate, a Latino roommate, and a white roommate, that is not the norm in this country. It is not. I don't care where you go. Like, that's not the norm. What a lot of people will see, especially those of us that went to college, once you get out of school, once you leave undergrad, once you leave grad school, once you get away from those academic spaces, and you become what I like to call a full-fledged adult, and you are going out now to intervene in real estate. You are going to look at real estate. You're going to look at property. You're going to go try to get a job at some of these companies where there ain't that many people like you, and they may already have their token black person in the department. Okay? You know, these kind of things. So it's like, that's what he has to understand, is that once you get out of those academic spaces, you're away from those campuses where you are not put together, you are forcefully put together, and you have the option of where you get to live. The majority of the time, those spaces are not integrated that way by choice. Most of those spaces are integrated by force. And that is something that I did notice myself, coming from a military family, having gone to undergrad and having gone to grad school. Once I got out of that, I noticed not as many people were actually willing to live in harmony together by choice. Let's go on.
You watched it. I was very struck during the George Floyd demonstrations by the vehemence, the anger of the young white people. They were so angry. Now, part of the anger was identification with what happened to George Floyd and what we used to call, my generation, killer cops. But that was, in my opinion, that was just the surface. Beneath it, white people, black people, they were angry at the system that had fucked up their lives and fucked up their futures. And the cops are the representatives, you know, the armed force of this system.
That is true. I agree with that. With George Floyd, you did see that. You saw white people and black people protesting in reference to George Floyd. And I would also say, too, it was a lot of younger people. There were some older people at those protests, too, especially even in Boston. But I will say, again, it's like, I think the reason why that protest was so successful is because of the fact that you really could not escape that video. And if you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. And we've seen other videos, but this one was different. You also have to take into consideration that during that time, at least in my state, we were locked down. We had no choice but to see. It was everywhere, whether it was on TV, on our phones, or whatever. Everyone was forced to stop and listen and pay attention. And I think that's the other reason why those protests were as large as they were. Right? They weren't just in the United States. They were across the globe. But what happens when people are not forced to stop and pay attention? Most of these police brutality cases are overlooked and not even reported by mainstream media, by the way, including some of the ones I've told you about. I just happen to catch someone's phone on Twitter and then I research it for myself. But a lot of times these things are not.
And so the anger was not just about racial injustice. It was about class injustice. So it was extremely inspiring. And then along comes Robin DiAngelo.
I don't think so. Okay, I disagree with more than I thought. I did not get the impression from protesters with George Floyd. I did not get impression from them that it was about class from anybody. The impression that I got is 100% racial. That was the impression I got. I'd never heard one person say this is a class injustice. If we would have added class to that, the movement probably would have been even bigger. But I think What is it, Joy? To be fair, Norm is of the older generation, so he has seen some improvement. But for people born after, say, 1970, the positive changes are minuscule. And we seem to be regressing. Never forget Rodney King. That's a good point, Joy. You're right. I think for him, he sees this as like, significant changes and things like that. I'm not trying to be too hard on Norm. I just think that there are some blind spots. And I think that, I don't know, if I talk to Norm, the racial stuff I would have to push back on from my own personal experience, Alrighty.
And what does she do? She plants in the minds of Black people, don't trust those whites. And then you know what she tells white people? She says, you have all the power. There's really no difference between some Amazon worker and Jeff Bezos because you're both white. And whites control the wealth. Whites control the power. So don't give up a good thing. Don't start talking about uniting with Black people because then you're going to lose your power.
He's talking about some people are asking who is he talking about? He's talking about Robin DiAngelo. She's the one that wrote the book called White Fragility. That's who he's talking about.
That's her message, and that's why she's loved by corporate America. She pits, she exacerbates. Real life, it exists. Obviously, racism exists. But is it the end of the story? It's part of the story. There's another part of the story, and the other part of the story was given witness by the Bernie candidacy, such that, as I was discussing the other day with Brianna Joy Gray, she said to me, quote, every demographic under 30, Bernie won. That's a very critical fact because they're the future. You're the future. Every demographic under 30, Bernie won, which means Black people, Latino people, they were willing to relate to a class platform.
I agree there. And I'm not going to carry on with this all night because Norm about to give me a headache. But what I will say is that that's true. Bernie really did capture the younger people. Unfortunately, though, when it came time to vote, people didn't turn out like they should have. That is a big part of it, though. Unfortunately, the age group that he captured is not the age group that consistently goes out to vote. And we saw that.